Oh, okay, that's quite something. Yay! Right, okay. Okay, that's fantastic. Sorry about that. The slight technical difficulty. So welcome back to the second session of Biodynamics 101. So my name's Rowan, and it's a real pleasure to be here again this evening. Before we start, I'd like to let those of you joining us live know that there are some useful links pasted into the chat, and for those of you listening back on YouTube, those links should be in the description for you. If you are listening on YouTube and you'd like to tune in live next time to this or one of our many other lecture series, head over to rosefolk.xyz to learn more. So this week we'll be discussing the Genius Loci, or the spirit of place, why it's important and how to find it, with reflections on my own experience with my allotment. But first I'd like to read us in with a prayer by Adam Bittleston. Measureless the starry heights, measureless the depths of earth, and about us everywhere, light receiving, warmed by wonder, spirits weave man's destiny. May the shelter of this house be a place of wakening. Peace within us, peace among us. Amen. And I would just like to draw everyone's attention as well before we begin to the calendar of the soul. So we're on verse 4 this week, and it feels quite appropriate given what we're discussing. So I'm reading the Push translation, so yours might be slightly different word-wise depending on the version that you have, and the online version is linked in the chat as well. Verse 4 reads, I sense a kindred nature to my own, thus speaks a perceptive feeling, as in the sun-illuminated world it merges with floods of light. To thinking's clarity my feelings would give warmth, and firmly bind as one, the human being and the world. So I think this feels like a really good verse to meditate on this week, and especially appropriate to our discussion today. The genius loci of your plot of land on which you grow is a kindred spirit, a friend to hold close, and a space to bind yourself to. So I think to begin with, in today's session, we need to just have a glance at what the genius loci is. So for those of you that don't know, originating from classical Roman religion, the genius loci refers to the protective spirit or guardian angel, essentially, of a place. In the context of biodynamic gardening, we also use it to refer more generally to the atmosphere and particular characteristics and history of a space, as well as the guardian spirit of it. So knowing the spirit of a place knowing the spirit of place for our land, wherever that land may be, is important in forming the close bonds needed to grow on and with the land. And I would just like to say that I use the term land because it does apply to all of us. This doesn't have to be land that you own or even a particularly big plot of land. For me, that land is a small half plot on an allotment site near me. So I need to be closely acquainted with the whole allotment site because my plot doesn't exist in a bubble separate from the other plots, but as part of a whole ecosystem. But for some of us, that land might be an entire field if you live on a farm, or just your back garden, or even a window box or a plant pot on your balcony. Wherever it is that you intend to grow, getting to know the entire area surrounding it is beneficial for both you and the genius loci you work alongside. Of course, depending on where you're growing, how you approach finding and working with the spirit will differ. So hopefully today I'm going to give you just an outline and a good idea of where to start. And you can take this and apply it onto where it is that you're working, what it is you've got to work with, and the area surrounding you. So when we start performing a Genius Loci audit, we first want to make an effort to really tune in to where we are. And it feels a little bit ironic sitting here and saying this while I'm talking into a microphone alone at my desk to people who only exist to me in the cyberspace. The push for a globalist world in which we're all hyper-connected to everywhere all the time has pulled us away from what, for all of human history, was just a given, the world immediately around us. So whilst I was doing my research for today's session, I stumbled across a really nice, quite concise article by the biodynamic trainee, who again is linked in chat, whose website I sort of had never heard of before, and he seems to have lots of links to lots of people. I think his name is Jason Warland. That seems to be the name that's on the website. But in the article in which he discusses a biodynamic audit, he says something at the very beginning that really resonated with me. And that is, when that is When that which is remote becomes familiar, that which is familiar becomes remote. The modern world has made it easy to forget where we are, which is so true. We all sit on our phones and on our computers, and you sort of become disconnected from everything around you, from the trees and the birds and everything that surrounds you and that has surrounded people exactly in the spot that you're sitting for hundreds, thousands of years. So just like last week, I'm going to ask you just for a moment to stop and take a deep breath in and look around you at the outside world, whether that means just looking up from where you're sitting or from standing at a window. And if your growing space isn't immediately close to you, but you'd like to close your eyes and picture there, do that, or just look out the window, and just take in all of the plants that you see and the lay of the land, and where trees and maybe bodies of water are sitting. If you're already familiar with the land that you grow on, then think of the soil composition. Do you describe it as loamy, sandy? What plants are growing around you? Can you identify all of the trees, shrubs, and flowers? If not, would you like to look those up? Would you like to take note of them? What about the animals that you see? Are there any that you recognise? Are there any that you don't? Can you see any animals at all? And is there any evidence of animals that you can't currently see? Are there molehills on the lawn? Or perhaps a hole in the bottom of a fence where a badger's gone through? It's really important to take in all of the intimate details of where you are, and just to ground yourself to your space and to the world around you. Yeah, just take a moment to look outside the window. There's a particularly nice beech tree outside the window where I'm sitting, so that's what I'm looking at whilst I'm doing this talk today. So to continue, the history of your space is the really first important step. So you can go to your local library quite often to access archives. You can go online and look up where you'll find those. So finding old maps and census records of the area that you'll be growing on and learning what used to be there is where I personally would recommend starting. So my allotment has really sticky clay soil with a really solid layer of clay about 2 feet down, like below the surface. And there's a small brook that runs through the bottom of the slope that the allotment site sits on. And the presence of clay has always indicated to me that it's a fairly damp site, that historically there was water there. But what I didn't know until I did my research for the Genius Loci audit was that actually the brook that runs down the bottom used to run where my plot is, and across the road there used to be a mill and pool and later a reservoir that provided water for the canal construction nearby. And that canal's a canal that I know really well. I've walked it countless times and actually more recently travelled down it on a friend's boat. And it's really quite wonderful to know that where my allotment is once facilitated the construction and filling of one of the many canals in the city that I live in. And that's something that's brought me a fair amount of joy and pride in the land that I'm working, that where I'm working was responsible for one of the beloved canals here. And a map from 1921 tells me that there was, for at least 10 years, an aqueduct running straight through the middle. So they got rid of the part of the brook and they built this aqueduct that completely intersects the site. Again, for the construction of the canal, which explains why it's so often understanding water. The site that I work on floods a great deal, but of course it does if it's built on top of water and then they've put more water on top of it. That just makes sense, and that's not something I'd have even considered had I not looked into the history of it. So I actually found an interesting write-up from a local history group with a directory from 1845 which describes the area, and it says this: the chief agricultural productions are corn and potatoes, with market gardening carried out on a considerable extent, particularly for strawberries. There's a blacking manufactory and a steel mill. The labouring population are chiefly nailers working in their own cottages. So knowing what's been on that land before makes me feel like I know the land and the soil and the lives that it's helped sustain. And a friend of mine who's also into biodynamics and gardening once joked that you wouldn't marry someone without knowing their personal history. So usually those conversations are happening on a first date. So why would you tear up soil and plant seeds without knowing the history of the soil, without knowing what used to live there? The life of our land goes on even after we're long gone. And in so many ways, it's more important than the lives of any of us. It predates and will outlive us, and it deserves the same respect as our fellow humans do. Something mentioned in the article I referenced earlier is doing a walk around your space, which is the second part of performing an audit. And this is something that I've done separate from just doing my own allotment. This is something I've done previously on a short course for biodynamics, but it's also something I've done with my allotment. So you take a real nice, long, slow walk round the space that you're in, and you pick up 4 items. I think we were told to do 3 or 4 items from all 4 kingdoms of the place. And those kingdoms are minerals, plants, animals, and humans. So on our allotment site, my minerals were several chunky stones and a good hunk of clay from the soil. Now, I don't know anything about geology. The stones are just stones to me, and that's probably something I should do more research in. But what I do know is that the clay, as I mentioned earlier, speaks of a very wet history. So you learn something just from looking at the soil, and I'm sure I'd learn more if I learned and researched the geology of the site. As far as plants go, there are several bluebells, which I didn't pick because that's illegal, but was quite happy to look at. Several hawthorn bushes down at the bottom, and lots of mare's tail, which is a plant that lots of gardeners feel quite distasteful towards. It spreads and it gets everywhere, but I quite like it. I like picking it up, and it's there, so it's part of where I am. Animals initially were quite difficult, so the surrounding area of my allotments really built up. But it doesn't mean there's no animals, it just means you do have to look a little bit closer for them. So there's lots of birds. I've seen loads of song thrushes and all varieties of smaller birds. There's also a large crow population who take a lot of joy during nesting season, pulling the babies of other birds out and chucking them around, which initially I'd felt wasn't very pleasant, but birds are animals and that's just part of that land. It happens every single year. And that's just what happens. I can't interfere with that. That's not my place. There are also foxes. I've seen a couple of them going for chickens down the allotment, and there are lots of them in inner city. But it's nice to know that they're thriving as well on allotment sites. And over the spring and summer, we have an absolute abundance of cabbage white butterflies. So even though I didn't actually physically collect any evidence of any of these birds or animals or butterflies, I did notice lots of them during my walk round. And finally is human activity. And this one's quite interesting because this can be recent human activity, or if you're really lucky, historical human activity. So along the edge of the site, I dug up several nails from underneath the soil, which I'm going to personally pretend original 17th century nails from when there was a nail making industry locally, although they were probably more realistically bought at B&Q a few years prior. But I can hope. But there's also lots of pottery shards in the soil, one of which a friend who's quite into her pottery identified as probably 18th century, which is much more exciting than my nails. I also once found a 1920s toy car broken and buried beneath the soil. And all of these, outside of the animals and the plants, these are evidence of other people walking on that soil and digging in that soil and playing in that soil. And you find yourself thinking quite tenderly about these people who don't know you exist, don't know their names. You're completely unaware of each other's existence, but you are united by the soil that you're walking on and the spirit of place that you share. So look around you and take a slow, deeply tuned in walk. and really, really assess very closely every bug and plant, all the moss and fungi, learn their species if you feel so inclined. Go to your local records office and find OS maps and land surveys and census records. Get to know what lives on your land now and what used to be there. Doing this will create an intimate and fully meshed relationship and identity with where you live or garden. You really start to feel like you know personally the sheep farmer from 300 years ago, or like me, the nail makers who worked there until the earliest 20th century and shared the soil that I now plant my carrots in. And if you are growing in a window box or on a balcony, do this too. You might not be planting into the soil beneath your feet, but you're planting into the space, and the spirit of that space must be respected by you. Even if you're in a concrete blocks of flats with no grass in sight, it didn't always look like that. And knowing the spirit around you is the first step of healing it from years of development by other, maybe slightly less spiritually tuned in people. The land we exist upon may have been desecrated, possibly by colonizers, possibly by land development, but in honouring the spirit of the land, we can give it back just a little bit of autonomy. We can start to slowly heal the genius loci that exists there. And so, what's the importance of this all? Yeah, I know what used to grow there. I know there used to be a brook beneath my feet. But what does it matter? Other than developing a relationship with it, what does it matter now for me? Well, it tells us how we work alongside the ecosystem and the historical setting that used to be there. It tells us what we should be planting to support the current ecosystem and what we can plant to fill niches that are no longer there due to development. And it tells us what can be grown instead of what we really wish we could grow, but we just can't seem to get started in the soil. So personally, I've made an effort to plant native wildflowers, as there aren't really very many in the area that I plant in. So there's a grass, but not very much for pollinators, and there are beehives on site, so I'm not the only one now planting wildflowers. So I've gone for lots of wet, soil-friendly flowers, things like primrose and knapweed, yarrow and self-heal, flowers that I like to imagine would have grown alongside the brook all those years ago. And that's quite an exciting thought, to know that flowers that have been on that land for so long are now being brought back consciously by those of us that are paying just a little bit of attention to it. And there's that deep interconnectedness that comes when you fully tune into where you are. You stop seeing spaces as just the walk to work or that road near my grandma's house. Instead, they become where that 17th century mill once stood, or on top of what used to be a sheep farm. You really quickly start looking closer at plants and animals. Find yourself looking out the bus window and grinning at the blossom in spring, or getting excited over the emerging fungi in autumn. And soon the world on your phone and the people in cyberspace, you find that they sort of fall to the side a little bit as you fall deeper in love with your land, and in turn it falls in love with you. And it's so easy to do. Just taking those little moments as you're walking down the road, and instead of listening to music down your headphones, listening to the bird song if there is any, or instead of looking at your phone, taking just little moments to observe the bark on trees. If you can't identify a tree or a plant, making a note of it, maybe even taking a cutting if you can, and going home and looking it up in a book. There's just little bits that we can do to be more interconnected to a space and to feel like we know it personally. And learning that spirit of place and really deeply getting to know it and learning to respect it as a living, breathing organism is the first step to biodynamic gardening. We can't possibly imagine that we can grow effectively on land that we don't know. There's no way to build flourishing ecosystems if we don't respect what's already there. And so, in a way, spirit of place makes sense, even if you're not gardening biodynamically, even if none of the other parts of biodynamics mean anything to you, even if you're going to go and whack loads of non-organic fertilizer in your soil, you should at least know what you're killing when you do that. Even if you're going to go and spray pesticides and weed killers all over your plot of land, should you not know what it is that you're destroying? And should we in turn not know what it is we're building up and what we're upholding when we go and we plant native species that would have grown there hundreds of years ago, species that support the other animals and plants that live there? I think that's really important, and ultimately sort of the whole point. So spirit of place is absolutely my favourite part of biodynamics. And if you take anything from these lectures, anything at all, let it be this. Let it be that knowing your space is a fundamental part of life. One that modern technology is completely stripped away from us, but one that we can still claw back. Even if you never mix a preparation or study star charts to find optimal planting times, you can still garden just a little bit biodynamically by knowing your land. And that will in turn help you grow more effectively and conscious of what has and does live there. Your crops will flourish alongside the natural habitat and which will create an ecosystem that's creating an ecosystem beneficial to all is sort of the most important part of all of this. Gardening in a way that upholds the land that you garden and the spirit interwoven with it is exactly what Steiner was getting at. There's no point in gardening against where you live. I could choose to try and plant crops that only like really dry soil, but they wouldn't grow very well, and I'd be left feeling disappointed and feeling like gardening wasn't for me. And that just doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense. And we live in a world where green space is getting smaller and smaller and the concrete jungle is closing in on us. So those little green spaces that do exist need to honour what's around them. So I think it's really important that we go away and we really try and think about what is around us, and maybe even see this as a little bit of homework to go and look and just kind of consider what it is that surrounds you, what it is that matters to the land that you're gardening on. Because there's really no point in gardening if you're not going to garden in a way that is effective to everything. What's the point in planting a plant if that plant's not going to flourish and that plant's not going to support other plants around it? We like to pretend in the modern world that we do live in a bubble, that we do exist separate to everything else. But we don't. It's just absolutely not the case. And I think trying to pretend so means that we end up gardening in a way that's detrimental to the world around us, that's detrimental to everything, and that in turn puts us off gardening. I don't see any point in that. So do go away and sit in your garden or on your allotment or take a walk round your local neighbourhood and take a real good look at what minerals, plants, animals and people surround you. Go into the archives and look at the history of your land and really deeply consider how you wish to plant in order to honour, not strip away, that history. If you plant and grow with the spirit of place in mind, then that spirit in turn will nourish your crops and your soul. And ultimately, that's what biodynamics is about. Growing with the land, not against it. So this has been our second session. Hopefully you've taken something from it. The next session will be the 13th of May, and we'll be covering the biodynamic calendar, which is significantly more technical than walking around and looking at plants and reveling in the joy of them. But we'll be looking at what the biodynamic calendar is, why it matters, and how to use it. I look forward to joining you all then, I'll read us out with another prayer from Adam Bittleston. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Upon the sustaining earth may we be upright. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Flowers and trees around us. Upon the living earth may our hearts waken. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Birds and beasts about us. Of all earth's offspring may we be guardians. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Light and dark, life and death. In all earth's changes, Christ may we find. Amen. So I will leave you now with one last reminder to love your space and all the delights it brings you. And until next time, which again will be the 13th of May, to discuss the biodynamic calendar, have a blessed rest of your day. God bless and good night.